This is a short presentation about visual and web rhetoric, how making and using images works to communicate rhetorically, how the way you design the look of a document or screen communicates rhetorically too. I've put this presentation here in this learning module because we're working with reports, and reports have a special obligation to represent information graphically, but I think you'll find these principles are useful to you in designing any kind of page or screen. So Edward Tufte, who is a authority on data and statistical visualization, talks about the cognitive science principles of visual display. And the basic idea is that excellence in visual design is realized through the creation of graphics that correspond to a mental task that they support. So if the thinking task is to understand causality, the task calls for the design principles show causality. If a thinking task is to answer a question and compare it with alternatives, then the design principle is show comparisons. Here's an example of what we're talking about. So this is a little chart that was prepared by a professor of management here at Salt Lake Community College, showing data about purchasing power over time for SLCC faculty compared to others. He says that what the data shows is that any qualified person considering becoming or remaining a full-time faculty member is the equivalent of a saint, since real purchasing to power decreased nearly 14% over this time period, while United States, Utah, and college presidents' purchasing power increased 50% over the past 30 years. Okay, now a political science professor at the community college put that on a graph. Now I think you can see immediately the difference. Now this is more rich in data. It has more specific data in it, but this shows a trend over time much more clearly. My colleague decided that because there were missing years, we could go from the late 70s to the early 90s right here, whereas this is 77 to 78. It could skew our sense of the data a little bit, so he put in some blank years in here to show a little bit more about realistically the span of time. You can see that each chart tells a slightly different story. Here's another example of how the visual representation of information can tell a story differently. This is a map, and you recognize it, I'm sure, as a map of the United States. It shows how each state went in the 2004 election. These are the red states that went Republican, the blue states that went Democrat. But if you resize the states according to population so that you see how they are proportionately with each other. So for instance, Idaho is a very large state in terms of land mass, but in terms of population it's much smaller. And if you compare it to California, for instance, you see that here with population you have a much bigger impact on the blue than Idaho has on the red. Okay, I encourage you to take a look. There's a link on a resources page for this presentation. Now, as you probably know, word processing allows you to have a lot more control over how a page looks, and if you're interested at all in web design, then you can do that same thing. The terms I've listed above, contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity, these are design principles, originally come from a book written by a writer named Robin Williams called The Non-Designer's Design Book. Those are widely in use by people talking about design. I took the image above from a free-to-download booklet. It's called Visualizing Information for Advocacy, An Introduction to Information Design. You can see, for instance, that this particular representation of the answer to this question, who backs an immediate ceasefire in the Middle East, all of these flags compared to only these small number of flags. That shows a great the great impact of contrast in terms of design, and I encourage you to take a look at that booklet. You can find it yourself again on that resources page. When you're thinking about web design, one of the things you should be thinking about more than almost anything is usability. I encourage you to take a look at the link that I'm giving you there, but also on the resources page. You want to think and control for how your reader will use the page. How will the reader's eyes travel across the page? How hard will they have to work to find what's a link and where to go? Will the design melt away so that the reader or the user can just gravitate to the material that you want them to find? And this, I think, is a great way to end our discussion about design. You want readers to be able to find what you want them to find easily, and you want their eyes to travel there, partly by the way you've designed the page. I hope these resources are useful to you as you think about designing your report and beyond.